In 1812, a 12-year-old boy named John Brown drove a herd of cattle over 100 miles through the American wilderness to the home of a U.S. Marshal. He did the grueling trek alone, impressing the Marshal enough to earn an invitation to stay at the house and rest. Inside, John met an enslaved boy around his exact age. The boy was smart, kind, and even made small gifts for his new friend. The two hit it off instantly, playing together as equals in a world that rarely allowed such a thing. But that brief window of childhood joy slammed shut at dinner. After the boy made a minor mistake serving the meal, the Marshal, the same man who had been so welcoming to John, grabbed an iron shovel from the fireplace. He turned on the enslaved boy and began viciously beating him over the head with it, leaving him bleeding on the floor. John watched helplessly. His parents were strict Calvinists who had warned him his entire life about absolute, unforgivable evils. But hearing about the cruelty of slavery from a church pew was entirely different from smelling the blood of a friend. In that dining room, the abstract concept of sin became a flesh and blood reality. The young boy made a silent promise to himself right then and there. He would dedicate the rest of his life to waging an uncompromising war against the institution of slavery. Fast forward a few decades, and an adult John Brown was doing his best to honor that childhood promise peacefully. He moved from city to city, quietly operating secret safe houses for the Underground Railroad and sheltering escaped slaves as they headed north. But his peaceful efforts felt like emptying the ocean with a teacup. The southern states, relying heavily on enslaved labor to drive their economy, were using the 3/5 compromise to secure outsized political power in Congress. They were legally expanding their institutions over the entire country. This political leverage culminated in 1850. Look at the text of this document. The newly passed Fugitive Slave Act legally mandated that citizens in the North actively participate in the capture and return of escaped slaves to their Southern owners. Up to this point, Brown had trusted the pacifist methods of his fellow abolitionists. Now, seeing an atrocity legally enforced at the federal level, he abandoned strict nonviolence. He formed an armed group called the League of Gileadites, specifically designed to physically fight off slave catchers. The law of the land now required every American to enforce deep cruelty. For a highly righteous man like Brown, this proved that when a system actively legislates and protects evil, writing letters and holding peaceful protests is no longer sufficient. The final blow to Brown's restraint came 4 years later. This map of the United States in 1854 highlights the problem. The newly passed Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed Western territories to decide whether to join the Union as free or slave states through a popular vote. Kansas shared a massive border with the slave state of Missouri. Settlers from both sides flooded across the borders to violently sway the upcoming election, turning the open frontier into a highly volatile powder keg. In May 1856, the powder keg exploded. A pro-slavery mob violently sacked the anti-slavery settlement of Lawrence, Kansas. The very next day, in Washington, D.C., a pro-slavery representative savagely beat an anti-slavery senator with a cane right on the Senate floor. Brown decided to fight fire with fire. He gathered a small group, including his own sons, and marched to the cabins of prominent pro-slavery settlers in the dead of night. They dragged 5 men out into the darkness and hacked them to pieces with broadswords. The Pottawatomie Massacre kicked off a localized civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. In its wake, the 55-year-old John Brown became a wanted murderer in the South, while many in the North viewed him as a hero. Any remaining hope that the moral arc of the universe would bend toward justice on its own was dead. Brown was convinced the government was completely corrupted by evil, leaving him no choice but to deliver God's violent judgment himself. By August of 1859, John Brown was a heavily hunted fugitive. He arranged a highly secret meeting in an abandoned stone quarry in Pennsylvania to lay out his ultimate plan. The key attendee at this clandestine gathering was his longtime friend, the prominent activist and escaped slave, Frederick Douglass. Douglass sat and listened as Brown detailed a plot that went far beyond border skirmishes. Brown planned to march his men into Virginia and launch a surprise raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His goal was to seize over 100,000 rifles and muskets stored there, hand them out, and incite a massive, violent uprising of enslaved people across the entire South. Douglas refused to join, recognizing that attacking a federal building with a handful of men was a suicide mission. This plan moved Brown beyond hunting rogue militias and directly into a state of armed conflict with the United States government. Despite the warnings, Brown moved forward. On the night of October 16th, he and 18 men slipped into the town of Harper's Ferry. They quickly cut the telegraph lines, captured the arsenal, and took hostages without much resistance. Then they waited for the army of the enslaved to arrive and take up the stolen arms. But word of the raid didn't reach the local plantations in time. The massive uprising Brown had banked his entire strategy on never materialized. Instead of reinforcements, word of the attack reached the surrounding towns. That next morning, Brown and his men were trapped inside the armory's fire engine house, totally surrounded by angry local militias and a detachment of U.S. Marines commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee. The standoff was incredibly brief. The Marines stormed the building, shattering the heavy wooden doors. In a matter of minutes, half of Brown's men, including his own sons, were killed in the chaotic firefight. Brown himself was badly wounded and taken into custody. Tactically, the raid on Harper's Ferry was an absolute disaster. But by attacking a federal target and forcing a highly public trial, John Brown unwittingly secured exactly what he needed to force a national reckoning: the full, undivided attention of the entire country. He was swiftly tried and convicted of treason. On the morning of his execution, Brown made no grand speech. He simply handed a small scrap of paper to his jailer, reading, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." He was hanged, but his words sent shockwaves through the country. Abolitionists in the North elevated him to the status of a martyr, eventually singing songs about him as the Union Army marched into battle. Meanwhile, terrified Southern slave owners looked at the Northern sympathy for a man who tried to slaughter them and rapidly accelerated their push to secede. John Brown's descent into extreme violence remains a contentious point in American history. However, the polarization following his raid and execution effectively ended any chance of a peaceful resolution, moving the country toward the conflict that would finally abolish slavery.